Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve. A great way to support the show is by becoming a patron on Patreon. And you can just go over to Patreon and search for History of the Papacy, or you can go to our website, a2zhistorypage.com, to learn more. Traditional Christianity had 4 patriarchates located in the cities of Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, and each of them had a archbishop. And in the History of the Papacy Patreon, there is also this hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, you are listed on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. And the earlier you sign up, the higher you will be commemorated on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. History of the Papacy Diptychs fun fact: about 1,000 years before what we are going to talk about in today's episode, there was a major argument in the church whether the laity should be able to participate alongside the clergy of Rome in electing a new pope. For a time, it was ruled that there should be universal suffrage for papal elections. By universal suffrage, I mean only the nobility, and the power of papal elections would even eliminate them and revert back to only the clergy. Not too long in the papal history, but hey, one step forward, right? Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, and William H. at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, and Alex the Great. And Patreon is just a great way if you want to really help and become a part of the show and help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. As you know, we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows such as Chris Mowery's Vlogging Through History podcast, among many other great shows. The papacy almost wasn't. In the last years of the 18th century, the entire idea of the popes of Rome as leaders of the Roman Catholic Church was down to its very last chip and was as close as you could possibly get to walking away from the table. And that's what we'll talk about today. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. We can't just dive into how the institution of the Roman papacy fell on such hard times by the mid-19th century. We have to back up, but just a little bit. The papacy changed after the Reformation. The institution lost some of its prestige. The popes lost some of the power that they had built up as princes of Europe. Obviously in the Protestant lands for sure, but also in the Catholic lands. The Catholic Church saw huge success though during this time period, spreading their message and their church throughout the entire world. Some of it was up to them, some of it was circumstance, but it did help them. They adapted well to this new environment, you might say. But in this time period, reform was the name of the game. The Catholic Church reformed in many ways. This is called the Counter-Reformation. And we really don't talk about the Counter-Reformation that much, but really many institutions were formed or set up at the Council of Trent. This council convened over the course of 20 years between 1545 and 1563. There was a lot of what you might call house cleaning during this council, which is considered an ecumenical council of the Catholic Church, the 19th ecumenical council to be exact. The papacy of the 1600s to the 1700s was not the greatest time in papal history, but it wasn't the worst either. Some popes were good, others were bad. This era encompasses the nearly 200-year-long bearded phase of the papacy, where every pope for nearly 200 years had some sort of facial hair. See our YouTube episode on this fascinating time period in papal history. It's also one of the greatest times for art and architecture in Rome. It's the Baroque period. I also have an episode on that if you want to go back and listen. Some people call it Baroque, Baroque. I don't know, I lean Baroque, but you go with what you prefer. The papacy's secular control over the papal states was fairly strong, and the leadership the popes provided was not terrible. Everything, though, comes to a screeching halt with the Enlightenment, but even more so with the French Revolution. The French Revolution was an absolute unmitigated nightmare for the papacy. The Enlightenment and the French Revolution could have easily ended the institution of the papacy and even completely altered our modern idea of the Catholic Church. The French Church and the Catholic Church in France had always had certain rights and privileges. These rights were forged over the course of centuries, but really crystallized around the idea of Gallicanism. Gallicanism, in short, was that the French civil authorities, be it the monarch or other leaders, had a significant say in the affairs of the Catholic Church in France, and almost at some point somewhat approximating the power that of the Pope. Think of something just short of the place of the King or Queen of England in the Church of England. The popes never loved this idea, but there really wasn't much they could do about it, and it didn't really affect things as far as the papacy went, until the French Revolution, that is. Right before the French Revolution was the Age of Enlightenment, and the Age of Enlightenment took different flavors in different areas. England, Scotland, the continent. There was rationalism, the respect for religious freedom, liberty, progress, science, scientific observation. We have the rise of many modern concepts like economics, both capitalism and socialism, and really a discussion about how does commerce and national economics really work. We have all these newfangled ideas are just swirling around. The American Revolution was an enlightened revolution in many ways. Many of the leaders of the American Revolution were highly invested in Enlightenment ideals. The American Revolution was a violent affair. It was a war, after all. But it took a different character for a whole host of reasons than upcoming revolutions. And this is due to some of the particularities of the culture in the Americas. The ideas of religious freedoms were really promoted, and that's the idea of the separation of church and state. Churches were not supposed to be supported by the central governments. That caused a lot of problems. Central governments would not administer or play a role directly in church affairs, at least by the American ideal. Governments wouldn't establish an official church in the United States. Established churches were common all over Europe. One primary church in a land that enjoyed state sponsorship. Still, many had religious freedoms of a sort, but even people not of the main religion of the established religion group, they would still have to support the established religion through their taxes. And that caused a lot of people a lot of consternation. Now, this French Revolution would go in a completely different direction than the American Revolution. I'm going to give you the French Revolution in short, even though it's ridiculously complicated and there's all different places you can learn more about the French Revolution. Books, podcasts, audiobooks, you name it. The French Revolution started in 1789 and it lasted nearly 10 years. It changed every aspect of life in France. The monarchy and the aristocracy were attacked, and many people were killed. This revolution attempted to reform or revolutionize government, religion, culture, all the way down to changing the names of the month. This is where we get the metric system from. They wanted to change how people measured things, a total different change in the way people, all the way down to the most common person, viewed the entire world. I won't get into all the ins and outs of the French Revolution. That's a whole different show, a whole different book, a whole different YouTube series, you name it. And even if you don't know all the details, you know this was a major time period and a major transformational age. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. The French Republic that took over from the French monarchy, they didn't love religion, and many of the leaders hated religion. The French revolutionary government really embraced this idea of Gallicanism, though. Priests were forced to take a loyalty oath to the French government, which was often in conflict with the oaths that they took to the Catholic Church and to the Pope. Many priests refused these oaths to the government and were severely punished for it. Priests had to be paid and financed directly through the French state, not through tithes and donations to the church. This had the effect of further separating the clergy from their traditional support mechanisms and the papacy. The French episcopacy was reformed and reorganized as well. One of the major parts of the French Revolution was the spread of French revolutionary ideas all around Europe and especially into Italy. This was done militarily in many cases. The French military campaigns into Italy were led by someone you may have heard of, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was a Corsican general, and Corsica is really interesting because even though Corsica had become a part of the French crown and then the revolutionary French nation, it was very much removed from what you might consider quote unquote French. The Corsican language and the Corsican culture was much more Italian. So we see that somebody like Napoleon Bonaparte kind of has his feet in both an Italian ideal and a French ideal, which will become quite interesting. The French launched a two-pronged attack on papal power. They attacked papal secular power in Italy in order to destabilize the Pope's secular power. They also tried to destabilize and attack papal religious power, and they really tried to erode that. What the French were really trying to do is drive a wedge and maybe even a stake into the heart of the Catholic Church, but especially the Roman papacy. Now let's just leave the French Revolution for a moment and talk about this idea of Gallicanism, a French ideology. But this wasn't the only one localist ideology going on. There were other reforming movements inside of Catholicism. We have Febronianism, Josephism, Jansenism. Each of these groups represented different areas of Europe, particularly the German and the Austro-Hungarian areas. We'll cover each of these in more detail in separate episodes. Now, for today's purposes, we really want to talk about how each of these groups wanted to further reform practices in the Catholic Church, even more than the reforms of the Council of Trent. They wanted to take certain ideas and bring them into their own spheres. Some of these people's reforms and some of these groups were incremental and some were radical, and some were even more radical than the Protestant Reformation. Generally, they wanted to liberalize the Catholic Church or bring it up to full-blown Enlightenment ideals. There was also a goal of limiting papal secular and religious power. Many of these groups didn't approve and even found it scandalous that the Pope was a secular lord. Many didn't like the centralized theological religious power of the papacy. They wanted more local control of religious affairs, things that you might see with the different Protestant reformations, but even also the Orthodox churches of Eastern Europe that had their own. Each country had its own national church, and that's a process that was kind of evolving even more so at this time. These reforming groups led to a big push against an ideology that the popes were really going all in on, called Ultramontanism. Over the mountains, meaning the other side of the Alps, Italy, Ultramontanism wanted more control of the church under the popes and less local control on ideas of practice and theology. Under Ultramontanism, the local bishop would really just become a pass-through of the papal decision-making apparatus. Proponents of papal primacy, the Pope over all bishops, and papal infallibility, that the Pope's extra-Catholic teaching is completely free of error under certain circumstances, they're also building up their case at this point. Papal primacy and papal infallibility will become major issues in this series. We will develop these ideas as we keep going on. All throughout the entire podcast from episode 1, we've been charting the course of the development of these two ideas, papal primacy, papal infallibility, and they will come to complete fruition in this series. These ideas in both the secular and the political world of Reformation and conservation, liberalism, modernism versus conservatism and traditionalism, they're all spinning around. So these are the lines that are being drawn in the 18th century, and a great deal of conflict was unfolding. Now, liberalism, modernism, conservatism, traditionalism, they're all dynamic concepts. A churchman or a layman could be any of the above and still be Catholic. Secular politics and religious politics are all becoming intertwined during this late 18th century time period. The popes, in a lot of ways, were stuck in the old way of doing things, and they were doing this in a rapidly changing world. This is the time of modernism. This is the things to keep in mind during this whole period. The papacy was an institution that was very well evolved for a different world and wasn't able to pivot in the late 18th century in a changing world that was changing at light speed. Now, let's pile on one of the newism, nationalism. When we left our last series, there weren't any nations as such in the modern sense. You got the Eastern Roman Empire, and it gets close to the concept. The Franks, the Lombards, the Anglo-Saxons, the Visigoths, Arabs. These were local tribal kingdoms. They might control other people or tribes, but they were not organized as a nation. During this early time period that we left, there was a bigger organizing philosophy of society, and that was belonging to Christendom, to being a Christian. And then we'll see in the House of Islam will come up, and those were the guiding principles. It really wasn't the nation that you lived in, or even maybe down to the locality that defined your identity. It was your religion and your locality. Now, the popes were the titular head of Western Christianity. Maybe not the actual leader of the West, but they held a ton of moral authority. Getting back to the 18th century, we actually have nations. We have France, the burgeoning Germany, all these tiny little principalities that kind of were their own nations. We have the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have Spain. We have Portugal. We have Great Britain. All of these wanted to further their own national interests. The power and prestige of their nation was paramount to them. The papacy had different goals that were at odds with all of these ideas. The papacy always wanted to protect the papal states. They also wanted to protect the religious influence that they had over all Catholics around the world and in Europe. The papacy was a transnational organization. Individual nations, though, they didn't like that there was a power outside of their direct control that could affect their internal and external national goals and ambitions. The Pope and the papacy had interest in and concern for all Catholics, not strictly a cynical power concern, in some cases an actual concern, a pastoral concern. Being an actual political power, the papacy that is, and having a very strong transnational identity pushed and pulled the papacy in many different directions, but not always with the best of outcomes. All of this is only the tip of the iceberg, and we haven't even talked about a single actual pope yet. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. We talked about France, the German states, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and even the United States, but we forgot all about Italy. Don't worry, I have not forgotten about Italy. Italy was not Italy in the 1700s and the early 1800s. In fact, the Italian peninsula hadn't been more or less under one polity, arguably, since the Byzantines controlled a big chunk of it over 1,000 years before. Italy was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities. Let's take a look at what was going on in Italy, and we'll start in southern Italy because it's the easiest to explain. This is where the Kingdom of Naples was. This encompassed pretty much the southern half under the Papal States of the Boot and then Sicily. It was a swirling mess of French, Spanish, and Holy Roman Empire politics going back hundreds of years. It was ruled by a king related to the French royal family, so this kingdom had no love for the French Revolution. Then let's just skip over the Papal States and talk about northern Italy. Northern Italy was made up of several smaller duchies, counties, and republics. There's the Kingdom of Sardinia, Savoy, which started to make a name for themselves. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had a ton of influence all over northern Italy, even controlling certain key points. And then smack dab in the middle of that is the Papal State. The Pope was the prince or the king of the Papal State. The size of the Papal State and the areas under control of the Papal States expanded and contracted over the ages. But for the most part, it connected the Adriatic and the Tyrrhenian seas. At some points, it extended as far north as almost to Venice. And it's really, when you look at it, it's not an insignificant amount of land, much bigger than most of the, if not all of the northern Italian principalities, but not quite as big as the southern Italy Kingdom of Naples. This was the king's land. He was the king and the absolute monarch. These popes jealously guarded the prerogatives to this land, and they were always trying to solidify it and expand it. Papal claims to these lands went back into the deep, deep past. Some claims go back to forgeries that were written in the times of late antiquity, early Middle Ages. Think of the donation of Constantine, and they go back even further than that in some cases. In reality, though, the land the Byzantines held in Italy slowly devolved to the Pope's power as Byzantine control failed and faded. The Byzantines contracted and the popes were able to expand into that. Charlemagne gave rights to certain lands to the Pope and to the church as well. This is the ironic part, and I'm giving away part of the plot right here. What a Frankish emperor gave in the 700s would be taken away by the French emperor in the 1700s. And as I keep saying, this should have been, and very well could have been, the end of the Papal States. In a way, the Papal States and the idea of the Papal States was really broken at this time. The states really were Humpty Dumpty that got patched together, but they could not hold. They were on life support, and really, and their years were numbered after this. But let's switch gears to what this really means for our episode today, at least. We're going to take a look at a story of two popes and the beginning of big changes for the papacy and the church. Let's talk about Clement XIV, who was pope from 1769 to 1774. A few dominoes just getting flicked over during his papacy that really lead to some significant damage to the papacy. The papacy was getting squeezed on all sides. The absolute monarchs wanted to control the church. The enlightened monarch wanted control of the church and religious freedom. The papacy was against both of these propositions. This is where we see the rise of Febronianism in the German lands, basically the German version of Gallicanism. Then we see the rise of Josephism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and that's their version of Gallicanism and Febronianism. Portugal and Spain are pushing hard against the Jesuits, and the Jesuits, they were loyal, fiercely loyal, and answered directly to the Pope, not to local bishops or secular leaders. The Jesuits did things their own way, which the European leaders, particularly in Spain and Portugal, didn't like, especially concerning some things that the Jesuits were doing in Spain and Portugal's colonies. Don't get too worried about all of these groups: Josephinism, Febronianism, Gallicanism, Jansenism, which is another one, and the Jesuits. We'll have detailed episodes about all of them and the reforming movements and really how they play into what's going to happen. Clement issued a papal bull called Dominus ac Redemptor, which fully suppressed the Jesuits. Basically, what Clement did is he totally caved on the Jesuit issue, caved to the Spanish and the Portuguese. This showed major weakness on the part of the institution of the papacy. Clement died of natural causes due to his age and likely the stress he was put under. Some claimed he was poisoned by the Jesuits as kind of payback, but doctors even at that time said it wasn't true, and it doesn't seem to be true, but it's a nice conspiracy anyways. And this will set the stage for all these Jesuits being turned into Dan Brown-esque mega-villains in many corners of the culture. Now, that's not to say that the Jesuits were angels in many ways, but they aren't the devils that they're often portrayed as either. History's gray and all that good stuff. In the end, Clement probably did everything he could do to try and shore up papal power, but there really wasn't much he could do. Clement died on September 22nd, 1774, and the next pope wasn't elected until mid-February 1775. This whole period's famous for really long papal conclaves, from several weeks to several months. Modern conclaves are usually measured in days, sometimes even hours. In the 18th century, conclaves were so long because several European countries could veto papal candidates that they thought would go against their national agendas. This canceled out a lot of high-quality people and dragged out the process, and it wasn't a good look. Finally, there was a new pope, and that's Giangelo Braschi, Pope Pius VI. He reigned from 1775 to 1799, the longest papal reign up to that point and the fourth longest of all time. Remember that name. Most times we don't care about a pope's birth name, but Pius VI's name will come back up. Pope Pius VI was handsome, and he knew it. He really cared about such things. He was a massive builder, not a bodybuilder, builder of churches. He spent big on art. He spent on palazzos and even public works projects in the papal state. Also, he wasn't against a little nepotism for his nephews. Pius VI was a real throwback to an earlier time in the papacy. He kind of reminds you of a Renaissance pope. The American Revolution happened during his reign. Not a big deal directly for him, but some interesting what-ifs come out, such as a what-if of Quebec joining the 13 British colonies, traditional British colonies. An attempt was made with the Jesuit John Carroll and some others, including Ben Franklin, to get Quebec to join the Big 13. John Carroll, interestingly enough, went on to be the first Catholic bishop in the newly founded United States. Carroll fell in line, if you will, with what was going on after the suppression of the Jesuits, but he did write in support of them. He founded Georgetown University. There's also some bigger issues that got tackled. He advocated for a vernacular liturgy. He didn't want his appointment to bishop look as if he was being appointed by a foreign power, the Pope, because that was a big no-no with the Americans. And he moved for a lot of trying to get some independence from Rome. But as we said, Rome was not a fan of local appointments of bishops or vernacular liturgy, so that put him at odds with what was going on in Rome. Pius's long reign was big losses, one after another. He tried to confront Emperor Joseph of Austria-Hungary on his Josephinism reforms. He was received politely, Pius, but gained absolutely no concessions from Joseph. In 1786, Pius wanted to set up a embassy or a diplomatic representative in Germany. The German bishops, though, completely shut that down and said it was not necessary. And that was a big embarrassment for the Pope. Closer to home, we have the 1786 Synod of Tuscany. This was held by Grand Duke Leopold II, who just happened to be Joseph's brother. Fun fact, Marie Antoinette was their sister. This was a very enlightened church council. It adopted something called the Gallican Articles, and this said that the Tuscan bishops didn't have to follow the Pope's declarations. This was a very political synod trying to limit religious power of the Pope in order to increase the political power of secular leaders. Events went from bad to worse for Pius, though. The French Revolution. Pius denounced the French civil constitution because of the provisions for requiring clergy to swear the oath to the civil government. The French sent Napoleon to attack the Papal States when the Pope wouldn't dial back his condemnations. Now, obviously, Napoleon mopped the floor with the Papal armies. Napoleon required huge payments from the papacy, and the papacy paid in the terms of art, manuscripts, and land. In 1798, a French general was killed during rioting in Rome, and that was all the raison d'etre that the French needed to wreck the Pope and the papacy. After they had done that, something called the Roman Republic was declared. Pius VI was removed as secular leader of the Papal State. At this point, Pius was very sick. He was dragged all around Italy as a prisoner. Finally, he was brought to Valence, about halfway in between Avignon and Lyon. And just to give a little information, Avignon was obviously where the Avignon papacy was. Avignon was still under papal control, and it wasn't taken away from papal control to French control until the 1780s. So just a few short years before this time period. Anyway, Pius was in terrible health by this point, and he died in Valence in 1799. His death certificate just read, Citizen Broski, occupation Pontiff. Pius VI was able to get his instructions out about how the next conclave should go down. He said it should be held in Venice, which was Austrian territory, and really he wanted to keep it as far away from French territory as possible to try and limit French meddling in the conclave. So that's it. In 1799, the papacy was, as a secular power, was dead. The religious power of the papacy was all but dead. Sort of like one of those people who's declared dead, but not quite dead yet. The 1799 conclave could have easily have been the end of the institution of the papacy as we know it. So many possibilities for alternate histories can be found in this time period. What really happened after this terrible Papacy is amazing. It couldn't be written by the best fiction author. Truth is truly stranger than fiction. The papacy was down to its very last chip, but was able to go all in and scrape together enough to get into the next hand of the game. Let's see if this is just a temporary reprieve or if the papacy can really get back into the game. And we will get into that very soon.